We live in an age of political chaos. The old ways of doing things no longer work like they're supposed to. So, where do we go from here? On this episode of Forge and Anvil, I will be joined by Jay Burden to discuss political realism and where we go from here. Welcome, everyone, to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the cultural, political, and spiritual war that we are living in. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, just doing my best to represent him well wherever I can. As I mentioned in the opening, I am joined today by anonymous guest, Jay Burden. So, Jay, go ahead and say hello to the audience and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I'm primarily known on the internet as the host of the Jay Burden Show. It's a roughly twice weekly interview show where I talk to all sorts of various and sundry internet personalities. I share sort of a similar collection of descriptors as you do. Kind of come from that Red America Christian evangelical community. Those are my people. Whatever my disagreements with them, that's still what I count myself as. And as far as my political priors, effectively, and you sort of teased this in your cold open, I consider myself a realist first and foremost, right? That really the question of politics is, to kind of paraphrase Bismarck, right, is the art of the possible. We're dealing with the world as it is. And I came to that conclusion through a number of sources, right? I kind of burned through the Italian elite theorists, obviously starting with Machiavelli, but also through Mosca and the others, but also from, a certain theological position, which is effectively, man is fallen. I don't want to turn this into, a sort of a screeching Calvinist debate. I have little patience for that, right? But coming from a background where it is very clear that, every part of the human is corrupted, right? The will, the body, the soul, all of those are kind of affected by sin. Well, we need to reflect that in governance, and fundamentally governance and politics are core to what it is to be human. And obviously, oftentimes people in our side of things will say like, oh, I want to go back to a time where things were depoliticized, where not everything was so political. And really, I sympathize for that. I'm, a younger man. I kind of grew up during the Bush era, and things were fairly political then. Admittedly less so than they were from the kind of 2016 to 2022 range. But even then, it was a politicized culture. And so when people say that, they're calling back to a time where politics was not everyone's entertainment, or something that happened in the background. And really that was facilitated by the fact that most people were generally on the same page, or at least kind of within a few shades of each other. And that isn't the default, that isn't the neutral state. That is a very specific fruit of a very specific type of culture. It's sort of and I realize this term has developed kind of a negative connotation, but it is the kind of waning fruits of cultural Christianity, right? Where even if everyone is in a literal kind of, believing, Christian, well, that is the cultural norm. That is what everyone is supposed to do. And as that consensus has fallen apart, well, obviously politics has had to become a more prominent, part of our lives, because no one agrees on anything. And so really, like when we talk about politics, there's two layers to it, right? There's the kind of tabloid level, which is like, what is XYZ politician doing today? And then there's the kind of like deep politics, right? Which is how humans organize themselves. And I said earlier that that's a core part of the human psyche, right? Aristotle said that a man is a political animal. And when you look at like what is the core question of politics, it basically is the means by which you settle those kind of like first order real disagreements, right? So obviously there's these kind of second order disagreements, which, Connor, let's say you and I go to church together, we get into an argument in the parking lot and the pastor says, all right, gents, knock it off. We have a common sense of authority there. We can both say like, all right, I consent to that. That's what I agree. We have a shared arbiter. But when you don't have a shared arbiter, as we very obviously, that is the case in culture now, well, all of a sudden politics becomes a really nasty kind of life or death struggle. These two parties have mutually exclusive views about any number of things, sex, gender, what is the purpose of a man, even saying that word man, right? And so at that point, we see kind of real no holds barred politics. It is essentially when you have an in-group and an out-group who want to live in fundamentally different ways. That's what politics is. And so that's why, when I look at these questions, what I'm really digging for is not, again, like I said, the kind of day-to-day tabloid version of that, but that kind of, real, like, how do humans organize themselves? What are the kind of eternal principles that govern the way that, man as an animal operates? So anyway, sorry, that was probably a much longer answer than you were looking for, but that's kind of where I come from. And, obviously that affects my work when I'm talking to different people, because fundamentally ideology and politics are often, viewed as the same thing. And,
Yeah.
Ideology is this sort of synthetic state religion, this kind of all-encompassing view of the world that has an explanation for every cause. And that's a relatively new thing. Ideology is really a product of, the 19th and 20th century. And really the era of ideology was the era of the worst bloodshed in human history, right? I don't need to go through that, pick your favorite kind of mustachioed dictator there.
Right.
But nonetheless, right, when I talk about political realism, that is in contrast to ideology, right? We are not looking at the world through this kind of predefined prism. We're basically saying, like, well, okay, like, what are the variables here? How can we play them to our advantage so that the kind of life you and I want to live is possible and supported? So again, sorry, I realize I went on a massive tear there, but that's sort of who I am and what I do.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. That's a wonderful kind of introduction to kind of what I wanted to discuss with you, because one of the things that I think I'm noticing right now is we see this rise of a more pragmatic approach to politics from the younger generations currently, and I think that there's currently a collision course happening in real time between those who think that way and those who think more theoretically about politics, and I guess more abstract, and just talking about the next election, what happens next, and there's a place for both the boots on the ground, actual activism that needs to take place, the actual voters going to the polls, but then there's also so much more that needs to be stripped back to understand how we got here. And so that's kind of what I wanted to discuss with you. I mean, first and foremost, do you see this rising trend of pragmatism among the younger generations in American politics?
I do. And the term boomer is thrown around very sloppily. It's oftentimes
Yeah.
a pejorative. But what it's really describing is what a friend of mine, Nima Parvini, calls the boomer truth regime, right?
Mm.
Which is this sort of vision of the world, and it's passed down through movies, through music, through kind of culture, that paints the world in very stark moralistic terms, right? The ultimate goal of humanity is kind of individual self-expression. Anyone who wants to stop that, or to put a limit on that, is basically the same as Mustache Man from the German mid-century, and everything is kind of cast through that light. So a good example, right, because it's so universal, is Star Wars. So Star Wars is basically just space World War II, right? You have the French, the French resistance, the evil guys in capes, and it's that eternal story of turning over the social order for additional kind of personal freedom. Another great example is Dead Poet Society, right? I'll turn over this institution so that I can, I don't have to listen to my dad. I can be I can care about poetry and be a theater kid or whatever. And that kind of viewing the world through that lens of media, right, where effectively everything is about self-expression and everything is about kind of maximizing freedom. John Lennon's Imagine is kind of the perfect crystallized form of this. This is something that tends to affect a certain type of older person. Very much in the kind of, these people are kind of referred to by the portmanteau boomer cons, right? Boomer conservatives who, have those kind of priors and meld that with kind of a bastardized Reaganite conservatism, to basically view that, okay, what is the point of, let's just say, the right wing? Well, the point of the right wing is to, and this ties back to what I said earlier, right, maximize personal freedom, right, through kind of libertarian policies, like do whatever you want as long as it's not hurting me, right? And so we've had multiple generations who've kind of been steeped in that. And I think what has led younger people, perhaps you're in my age, to kind of reject that is we've sort of seen the natural consequences. We have seen that kind of like truly liberal, right? And I mean that in the broadest sense possible. We've seen the fruits of that. and it's not good. It's awful. And so I think that for a lot of people, myself included, there's sort of this realization. It's like, well, okay, like this is a very deep, deep problem. This is not simply the kind of problem you can fix by, electing a Mitt Romney type. This is not a problem that can be fixed by kind of rebalancing the variables in the kind of current political system. Like something deeply needs to change. And I think the consequences are obvious, right? People are obviously miserable. We can look at any metric you want, whether it be suicide or depression, any one of these, the fact that, people are lonelier than ever, that nobody is, having sex, let alone getting married, and see that, okay, something is fundamentally broken. And so from that, you're like, okay, well, how do we fix this, what seems to be kind of genetic bottleneck, right? That very few people are kind of passing on their lineage from one generation to another. Because fundamentally, on just a biological level, that's a very big problem, right, for the continuation of the human species. And it's like, well, okay, well, what are the available answers? Well, you sort of have this kind of tepid response from, our conservative brothers, which is basically like, oh, well, personal responsibility, or their taxes are too high, or people just need to work harder. And you're like, well, I mean, okay, maybe, but I don't quite buy that. And then you have the option from the other side of the aisle, which is just lean into it. It's happening and it's a good thing. Mm. And if you're really deeply concerned about these problems, you're like, well, okay, like let's start pulling at that thread. Like where did this problem arise from? And you start pulling and you start pulling and you start pulling until you realize like, oh, this is a very deep problem. That kind of, gradual creeping liberalism, that kind of freedom that we took for granted seems to have been a poison pill. The kind of emancipation that, and we can track this from the French Revolution, right? Kind of breaking down the connection between, the people and a monarch. Okay. Then breaking down, the traditional relationships between people and their jobs, their communities, men and women. And now to the point where we're attacking the bonds between, parents and children. And each one of those, it's sort of like pulling an atom apart, right? You release a ton of energy. The economy starts going. You can, in the case of letting women into the workforce, you can double your workforce. That juices the GDP.
Right.
And okay, that works, right? But it's like pixie sticks. You feel great. You feel high. You get a sugar rush. And then what happens on the other end? Just like pulling apart an atom, you're left with this kind of radioactive sludge. And the idea that, well, we can just pull a rabbit out of a hat again and again and again, I mean, I think that has not happened. And I'd love to be wrong. I'd love for there to be some kind of silver bullet that gets us out of this. But I think that, like I said earlier, we have to realize that we as Americans are still people. We operate under the same constraints that every other people ever has operated under. We're not special in that sense. And so, again, we start to look at, well, okay, if we take my premise, right, that the current order is not functional, things are not going well. You start to look around and say, okay, well, what civilizations have worked, right? What orders have worked? And you start to realize that, well, maybe in order to get a society that works, we're going to have to start killing some sacred cows. We're going to have to start considering things that would be, to put it mildly, major faux pas. And so I think that's really why so many people have become incredibly pragmatic. And it's not entirely, right? There's still kind of, ANCAP libertarians who believe that, everything would be fine if we just, abolished all taxes and got rid of the state. Right. But I don't consider those serious thinkers anymore. And so, again, a long-winded answer to a short question, but I think that's the reason that people are abandoning ideology, because we've seen where that leads. COVID is the great example. Yeah. Libertarians were the most consistent ideologues around. And then what happened during COVID? Well, nothing they said would happen, right? Everyone went along with it. Everyone made fun of them. And now the Libertarian Party is in the process of wasting whatever, kind of advantages that they had. And so again, right, you can pick your own favorite ideology, but fundamentally none of these kind of ultra consistent ideological camps get anything done. And we're in a situation where, at least to me, it seems like we're a civilization heading for an iceberg if we haven't already ran aground on it. And the idea that we should, in that situation, spend time just kind of bickering over ideological minutiae is unwise.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I've had that same conversation with so many guests on the show, that the orcs are in the Hornburg, and it's time for the elves and the dwarves to put aside their differences and and get to work. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I think what you're saying about the younger generation, you kind of traced it back similarly to how I would, which is that I think so many of those of us who are on the younger side of the spectrum have looked at the American mythos for answers. As we've seen, especially with COVID, COVID accelerated all these problems that we already had. But so many individuals like myself woke up to COVID, fairly apolitical myself. I was, born in a conservative household, though, but, did not pay attention to politics. And then suddenly this happens, and my eyes, you know, go wide open. But you start looking back at the American mythos and understanding, oh, well, what was making our society good at this period of time, and then you see, oh, actually, those problems were still there, and you start just like you said, pulling out that thread, and you realize that the most of the American mythos of today does not have solid answers because a lot of them is steeped in liberalism still. And so then you have to go even further back. And of course, you can trace it all the way back to the Garden of Eden and the fall of man, where all our problems really began. But you can still trace, a more practical way of tracing it back would probably be, sometime you mentioned with the French Revolution would be a good place to maybe start to understand the breakdown of these things. But I mean, ultimately, it just seems inevitable that liberalism unchecked leads to tyranny. And of course, that doesn't mean that your liberal aunt, is tyrannical, although she may have been personally during the COVID. That's up to you to decide that. But ultimately, we find ourselves down this pathway, and so I think so many individuals on the younger spectrum are starting to look further back. We're starting to look at individuals from 1,500 years ago we're looking at the early writers of the Western canon, because we're trying to understand, where did this truly go wrong? Because just looking back to the 1960s, although a lot of things happened that I would say accelerated our cultural decline, that's not where things started. The groundwork was laid long ago. So, I mean, you mentioned a moment ago talking about some sacred cows. So, what kind of sacred cows do you see that it seems that people are currently unwilling to confront?
I mean, I think that, and this is really the core precept of a certain strain of liberalism, and I don't want to overuse that term, but it is fundamentally the idea that humans are basically good and basically all the same.
Right.
So again, I've gone back to that concept of original sin and why I think it's so foundational to my thinking. And really, at its core is this idea, and at least I became aware from it at its earliest in Rousseau, right? This Rousseauan idea of the noble savage, which is essentially, man is at his most basic level good, and it is society, it is socioeconomic factors, right? To pull a line you'll hear liberals say often, that corrupts that kind of noble savage and turns him into a man who would rob a liquor store or something. But in addition to that is this idea of fundamental human equality, which is basically that every type of person is fundamentally the same. You even hear this in the way people talk about illegal aliens, right? The transition from legal alien to to migrant to undocumented person, right? Each one of those is kind of winnowing away at the difference between two categories. We're very uncomfortable as a society making categorical judgments.
Next, it's going to be a friend we haven't met.
Exactly. You see this even just to show you that this goes back in C.S. Lewis, right? In The Abolition Man, where he basically talks about the fundamental nature of beauty requires there to be a value judgment made, to say one thing is better than another. In the case of citizenship, right, it is saying this person belongs. He is part of this. He is part of the in-group in relation to all others, right? You cannot love your wife unless you prefer her over all women. You cannot love your children unless you prefer them. And so likewise, basically saying like, no, not all people are the same. In a theological sense, of course, that's true, right?
Right.
We are all made in the image of God. But fundamentally, right, and this goes back to political realism, that there is scarcity, right? It's the fundamental axiom of economics. There is not enough to do everything you want to do. In order to buy one thing, you must forego another. And likewise, when it comes to ordering a state, a polity, a church, you must say, okay, if you were a member, if you were a citizen, if you're a member of this family, you were entitled to things at the expense of others. And so I think that fundamentally, that kind of egalitarian urge to say, everyone is the same. And you see this as well in kind of, the current year gender politics, right? That, there's a large contingent of people, and I think of, the kind of IDW remnants like James Lindsay, for example, who will say, we want to go back to, the 1990s. We want to go back to this previous existing order. But if you look at, the claims made in a lot of the kind of media cited by those people as being particularly significant or admirable or something we should, kind of strive to imitate, a lot of it contains that core premise that, we're all basically the same thing. We're all the same person. Men and women really aren't so different. They can do the same things. They can serve the same kind of roles in society. And I think fundamentally what we're realizing more and more is that this is not true. We are not interchangeable widgets. There are kind of different categories and different values, and there have to be for us to have any sort of functional society. So I think that's a huge one, right? Equality. If you even going back to the French Revolution, right? It's liberty, fraternity, and equality. Okay, so that's equality. I mean, I think the other one is liberty, right? That idea that the purpose of your life is to maximize, your personal self-expression and freedom from all unchosen bonds. Yeah, and this is not something that is particularly my idea. You can go back to even figures like Peterson who talk about, kind of the meaning humans derive from unchosen bonds. But fundamentally, those unchosen bonds are what make you who you are. Going back to that idea of different categories, right? You didn't choose to be, the son of your father. You didn't choose to, be born in your country. And the liberals will say, well, then therefore, these don't mean anything. Like, well, why should you be proud of your country? You didn't choose to be born there. Jose from across the border, he wants to be here and you don't. So he's more American than you are. And again, I think that comes from that idea that, the most important thing is consent. You see this in campus sexual politics as well, right? It was very kind of daring and funny for slightly right of center comedians to poke fun at the kind of consent forms, right? What was the phrase they used? Was it earnest and ongoing consent or enthusiastic and ongoing? I can't remember. Point is, and I won't go through it because it's a little bit colorful, right? But the idea is that at every point in a kind of a sexual encounter, you need to be saying like, yes, I consent to this. Yes, I consent to this, which is, I won't go into it, but sounds a little bit, a little bit stiff. Point is, right, the core precept of that is that everything is okay if you consent to it. Nothing is okay if you don't. And so again, right, that's that core idea going back to what I mentioned earlier, that kind of boomer truth regime of, the worst thing in the world is for someone to restrict your personal freedom. And yet, when we look at like, okay, what grants you kind of meaning in life? What pulls you out of the kind of nihilistic well that we see so many of our peers, slipping into? What is that responsibility? It is that kind of, call to do something that you may not necessarily want to do that grants you meaning. So I'll tell you a personal anecdote. One of my best friends growing up, known him since we were, I believe, 9 years old. And he just had his first son, very new parent. And I was talking with him about 2 weeks after his son was born, asking, how he's doing, because, obviously he's not sleeping a lot. And he said, you know what? I just feel so good because for the first time in my life, I know exactly what I need to do. And it's not, it's not any one step is, particularly glamorous or fun. And it's not even like he knows exactly how to do everything, but it's like, okay, well, current objective, keep this thing alive.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay, that isn't like revolutionary. Lots of people have done that before, but it's very, very difficult to have a crisis of meaning, when you have a screaming newborn baby. And so, that's kind of a silly example, right? But I think that much like I said, how, people our age have started to see that the promises of kind of this literal progressivism are not there. Likewise, the promise of unlimited self-fulfillment. I mean, look at the people who've taken that to its logical end. I am whatever kind of gender I've made up. I've hacked my body apart to, meet this certain ideal. I demand that you treat me this certain way. I have made my self-expression, the most realized it possibly could be. And I'll just ask the rhetorical question, are those people happy? I mean, no, judging by about a 42% suicide rate, I don't think so.
Right.
And so again, I realize I'm kind of bulldozing over you in this conversation, but I think that those are the kind of sacred cows, which are, to be honest, very, very fundamental. I mean, even look at our own American founding documents, right? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That basically strikes at the core of all of those, which is why, you see this kind of term from, House conservatives or regime evangelicals. They call us the woke right, which is, if pardon my French, completely retarded. But point is, I mean, I think that's why those questions are coming up, and it's because the internal contradictions have become manifest, I guess.
Right. Well, in reality, you're just recognizing, that there are some things that are unchangeable. And it's really a sovereignty question because, I think about the realm of theology, and I'm no theologian by any extent. In fact, I've joked on the show before that I'm a theological midwit. I just, I try my best to understand theology, and but on the bell curve, I'm somewhere in the middle where I try to over nuance things, and so I'm trying to every day to get out of that portion of the bell curve. But but that being said, though, like I do think something that's kind of brought me over in more recent times to a more reformed thinking is just that idea of free will, because ultimately, even in the church, among Christians who are overall conservative in terms of a cultural sense, they still have an understanding of salvation that boils down to, a good God would give me free will. And at the end of the day, it ends up being like, you chose God didn't choose you, when you put it in simple terms. And of course that's opening a whole other can of worms. But I think that's where the slippery slope can oftentimes start, is just in that theological assumption of original sin and salvation, and where it comes from, and the sovereignty of God. And I think that's ultimately what it sounds like you're telling me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like that's ultimately where you started to draw these political conclusions from, is a proper understanding of the theology of original sin, and understanding proper soteriology, and ultimately having a proper a category to put these political ideas into. Would you say that's a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think also, speaking of ideas that will, bother certain people, this idea of, the separation of church and state, which I should just say, as often as that gets quoted at me, that is not in the Constitution, right? That is from a letter between, I believe, Monroe and someone else. I can't remember. I realize if I had the exact citation, this would carry more
Jefferson
weight.
to the Danbury Baptists, if I remember right.
Fair enough. Look, I'm glad that you had that. But point is, right, that idea is very deeply buried in our culture, but it contains a falsehood in it. And that is that kind of premise of neutrality, right? That you can have an institution that, views all comers equally. I mean, that's very obviously not true with our current institutions. And again, in the case that, the woke are more correct than the conservatives, the reason you didn't notice that before is because you shared the same cultural worldview, right? That you were sort of within the bubble. But, looking back at institutions, like the FBI, for example, right, who I'm no particular fan of, they've kind of been targeted towards people like us recently in the last 30 years. But before that, if people didn't match up with the current culture, like, for instance, they were communists or kind of American neo-Nazi types, well, they went after them. They were not particularly fair to them. And so likewise, when you take this kind of premise of, theology and politics as being separate, I mean, it's very clearly not how our forefathers looked at it. So, for instance, right, well, why were heretics turned over to the state to be burned? Right, I'm not a Catholic, but the Catholic Church never burned anyone. They handed them over to the state, and disobedience to the church was viewed as traitorous, right? And so they were killed by the secular authorities. Okay, that's shall we say, a medieval example. But fundamentally, that's how people always operate. That authority is your view of authority is sort of connected to your view of God, right? That there's this sort of chain of authorities. For instance, right, God is the ultimate source of authority. And then, well, okay, the next step down is it's like the king, right? He's kind of the head authority of a nation. And then you have, obviously, you can kind of go down that ladder. But also, right, your father is kind of this one authority level up from you. And so each one of those kind of contains a shadow one to the other, right? That there is sort of a chain of authority that runs through all of those. And the idea that, you can disconnect your ideas about God from your ideas about, the kind of genuine authority and good rule is one that I don't think is accurate. I don't think that's one we can kind of work with. And, oftentimes you hear these kind of more, moderate conservative types talk about, woke as a religion. And to be honest, they're not wrong. But the assumption is, well, this is bad because it is a religion. But fundamentally, all politics functions as a religion, right? You are taking morality and applying it to human governance. Like, what is right, what is wrong? And even if you don't say this is because the Bible told me so, it's all within the same kind of wheelhouse of morality. And when people say, oh, you can't mix your religion and politics, what they're basically saying is you can't mix your religion and politics, but I can mine.
Yeah.
And so you see that now, right? Where it's like, okay, well, how many, bizarre sexual minorities does Joe Biden kind of parade out in front of us? Well, a whole lot. And I mean, very obviously, those are kind of sacred figures to the progressive cult. It's the reason they keep doing these kind of, drag events with children. Not because there's any kind of like specific need to do that, right? But because it is sort of a religious act to them.
Right.
It is sort of passing your child in front of Moloch. If you'll let me, kind of draw, shall we say, a tenuous connection there. But and so to me, right, again, and look, I'm not a Christian nationalist. I'm friends with many of the people who are. But the idea that religion and politics are disconnected, that you can kind of talk about one without talking about the other, I think is kind of a modern innovation. When we look at the way universities were constructed, right? Theology was kind of pictured as the top, right? That is the most important. It's the reason, right, professors were called professors, right? Professors of the faith. And so when we look at kind of a more classical understanding of, these different disciplines, they were not siloed. That kind of extreme specialization is, a relatively modern invention. But the idea was that each one of these is kind of in conversation with the other. And so it's why, even a figure like Machiavelli, kind of this first of the realists, he talks about that. He talks about, kind of like pitching this to the Christian prince. And what he says is basically like, obviously, there are things you must do, as a Christian and things you must do as a ruler. They kind of inform one another. Now, on the other end, right, and I realize there might be sort of a contradiction there. There are actions that you could not do as an individual, but you must do as a political actor. And so, you see a lot of kind of like NPR progressive types writing things like, oh, evangelicals in America have thrown their morality away by voting for a man who has extramarital affairs.
Right.
It's like, well, okay, like if you could say, would you prefer a president who does or does not have extramarital affairs, all things being equal? It's like, okay, well, I mean, that's a pretty easy chance. But again, right, fundamentally, if we look at ourselves as realists, right, it's like, well, which president hates me, right? Which president will make it harder for me to live my life as I believe that, God has decreed.
Right.
And so like from that perspective, right, where it is very much a kind of like, a realist one, I think that it makes more sense. And so, sorry, forgive me if I'm, rambling here, but I think that there is, the conversation between, philosophy, politics, and theology is sort of all one conversation, just kind of different facets of it.
Yeah. I completely agree. I think the thing that I notice a lot, and part of this is just because of my audience and, of course, my upbringing. I have a lot of evangelical members of my audience who are just everyday church goers, and several of them that listen to my audience. I have multiple pastors that tune in on a regular basis, and I think that those individuals are some of the hardest individuals to sort of wake up to political action. When I mean political action, I mean how they approach politics as a whole. So since we've kind of already established that these things are not separate of one another, they're not in neat little boxes where we can focus on one subject at a time. There's so much overlap. How have you found to be effective ways of sort of waking those people up to the reality of politics and how they should be engaging with politics, how they should understand politics? I just love to hear you kind of give some of your takeaways as you've gone on this intellectual journey.
So there are kind of two levels to this, right? I'm fundamentally an elitist. I honestly believe that most people don't have political instincts
Mm.
in the same way that, these kind
Oh,
I think I'm still there. Can you
all
hear me?
right. You're back now. So you said most people you don't think have proper political understanding, I think is what you were saying. And I think you
Yeah,
cut
and
out
I
where you cut
don't
out.
mean
So
that in the Marxist sense, right? Where it's like, oh,
mm,
they just need to have their class instinct awoken. What I mean is that if you look at how most societies worked, politics was very much a minority game.
right.
Most people were not involved in the affairs of state. And I think that, to be honest, that they're better for it, right? That, there's, a number of people for whom, the kind of like that political part of their brain is kind of devoted to their immediate surroundings, to kind of their friends and family, that we can
Right.
imagine a village setting, right? But not necessarily this kind of like the great game, so to speak. And, really one of the worst things about liberalism is it has drug everyone into politics. It has made it
Yeah.
everyone's concern. And so you see this, right? What did the French Revolution produce? Well, it produced the largest citizen army Europe had ever seen. All of a sudden, when everyone's a citizen, everyone gets drafted. And all of a sudden, everyone else is like, oh, shoot, now we got to kind of pony up as well. But so I think that most people are not naturally interested in this. I think kind of left to their own devices, it would be kind of a minority concern. But because of democracy, right, we have that foisted on us. So when it talks about like waking people up, I don't necessarily know if I agree with the framing, because if you look at how most people work, it's that generally they tend to effectively go along with power, what
Mm.
power says. So you see this
Yeah.
in with gay marriage, right? Gay marriage is very, very unpopular, extraordinarily unpopular. And then you start to see this top-down signaling, right? Signaling in the form of laws being changed in media until we get to, kind of the 2012, 2013 timeframe where it is still unpopular nationwide. The Supreme Court decrees this is the law of the land. And then all of a sudden it goes from a 60-40 against 4 to a 30-70 support, right? People basically react with a little bit of lag time to the law. So I think that in general, most people are reactive in that sense. A lot of hay is made over kind of, the political turmoil of Germany in the 20th century. But, and there are multiple anecdotes of this, of people who, were all in for the Kaiser, all in for Weimar, all in for Hitler, and then all in for, the Deutsche Republic, right? Those were all, they had fans. Many of them were the same. So
Mm.
I think that that kind of whole frame of, winning people over, where it's like we need 50 plus 1% is not accurate. Most politics is basically
Yeah.
done by small vanguards. But on the other one, right, which is how do you talk to your friends and family about this? I like to think that I'm okay at it. I have an interview show. This is an unusual amount of talking for me to do. But really, you can get a lot by asking kind of leading questions. To kind of paraphrase, Fight Club, and how is that working out for you? Right? Don't say it so smarmy, but it's like, oh, I thought this would work. Okay, how is it going? Kind of ask those questions. And
Right.
I think that, for a lot of people, I think that it takes a certain personality to kind of end up on the kind of, should we say, serious right wing of politics. But I do think that a lot of people have kind of strong instincts. And if you start to just kind of pull apart, like very, very gently, just kind of ask questions like, oh, this doesn't make sense. Why did this happen? You can generally get people a pretty long way. So for instance, right, sorry, I just knocked something over on my desk. I have a friend of mine who's incredibly intelligent, went to Harvard, very, very historically knowledgeable, but sort of has the morality and the political sensibilities of kind of an 80s Republican, right? Hates taxes, hates the government. He kind of views everything in this capitalism v socialism lens. And so, we got to talking, and of course he's got a historical mind. So we're talking about the English Civil War. And so, he's talking about how, for a long period in, British history, Oliver Cromwell was basically viewed the exact same way that we view, a certain mustachioed dictator, right? Like he was Satan incarnate. And so look, like I'm not the biggest fan of that mustachioed dictator myself, but, just like I said about Star Wars, we have to understand that war, that event is kind of crucial to, the mythology of the U.S. empire, right? That is the justification for why we as the U.S. get to rule the world. And that's because we saved you from the human incarnation of Satan, right? That's why we're allowed to have military bases. I'm saying that in the most neutral way I can. And so I asked him, I was like, well, like, why do you think we can talk about Cromwell like this? And so he's like, oh, well, because we have some historical distance. And I was like, yeah, like, do you think that that's true about other figures? And it was a good conversation. We kind of was able to bandy back and forth because that kind of instinctual pressure of like, no, this is, what I was taught about in school. This is that like nuclear hot thing you can't talk about. You kind of step back. You're like, okay, like, do you feel this way about Genghis Khan? Do you feel this way about, and look, I'm not, by any means, a defender of, what happened in World War II. It's just, an interesting thought exercise of like, okay, like, let's step outside. Let's pretend that we are not 21st century Americans. Let's kind of step back and view this how, someone in the year 3000 would. And so I use that not as just a way to kind of pointlessly deconstruct, but basically say like, that's an example where you've taken possibly the most radioactive topic ever, since, 1945, and put it in such a way that's like, okay, we can talk about this as an adult. And I think you can do the same thing with other nuclear hot issues by kind of pulling back, reframing this, and then going about it in a way that's like, okay, well, like, let's talk about this. I don't have horns popping out of my head. So you can do the same thing with, with gender issues, with racial issues, with any one of these kind of like incredibly intense nuclear hot issues. And especially if you're someone who's talking in genuine goodwill, right? You're not trying to just be edgy. You're not trying to score points by shocking someone. You can get a lot farther than you think. And the last piece of advice, and this is general conversation advice, just get someone talking about themselves. And if you can pull that back to something you were saying, it's like, okay, you can kind of pull yourself along and kind of march down the field. I mean, obviously, the main question at hand is like, well, what do you want to accomplish in the first place? And if your question is like, well, this person has this kind of hair trigger associated with this idea, because a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about, like because of this kind of media reinforcement, people blow up. That's a tripwire. And so you can basically say whatever you want. Earlier I was talking about something that's very controversial, but if you say it in the right way, if you can imagine the kind of Mission Impossible scene of kind of, swinging through the laser tripwires or whatever, it's kind of like that. You can get to a very fruitful conversation. You just have to avoid saying the words that snap the tripwire, because oftentimes people don't really have an objection to the idea. They just associate that idea as, oh, that's racist. Oh, that's sexist. Oh, that's bigoted. And so if you don't trip the wire, you can get kind of behind enemy lines and figure out like, okay, like, what do you actually think here? Like, let's have a conversation. And so again, the reason I bring up, such a controversial, instance is not because I'm, a big fan of the Third Reich. Again, far from it. But that is pretty much the most impossible thing to have a neutral conversation about. That is, like I said, that's like defending the Death Star. That's like defending, Scar from the Lion King, anything you want. And so point is, I think that that's sort of the practical way to go through an individual conversation is just to not say the thing that TV has told them to expect the bad person to say.
Yeah. Well said. And you mentioned earlier about it's not about waking people up, and I agree with you. I'm currently going through Orrin McIntyre's Total State, and I know you're familiar with his work, and I think that's really what it really boils down to is it's the fact that we live in the total state now. It's the fact that we live in a liberal democracy that requires that not only if you have a platform, you're expected to steward that well and not say a bad thing, but you're also supposed to actively advocate for good thing. And so ultimately it boils down to in the total state, everyone is to be political. And so everyone's forced to be political in the total state. So now that everyone is forced to be political, we essentially don't have an option but to decide how we're going to steward the realm of politics. And that's where ultimately, I think that pastors especially really need to be thinking through these issues, because ultimately they're supposed to be shepherding these individuals that are now living in a society where you can't avoid being political anymore. And I think that there are many pastors who like to pretend that you can, to your point earlier, they try to have this emphasis on just preach the gospel. It's like, well, the gospel affects the realm of politics, and the politics affects the realm of the gospel. The gospel is, of course, more important than politics. I don't want anyone to misunderstand that. But politics can affect how effectively you can spread the gospel. Politics can also affect how we focus so much on witness. Politics affects your witness. It's a bad witness, to be using unequal weights and measures. The Lord hates that. And yet in the realm of politics, we see that all the time from leadership. And when a pastor just pretends that it's not happening, I think they're turning a blind eye to something that the Lord explicitly says that he hates. And so ultimately, I think pastors are going to be in a position in the coming years, and they already have been for a while, but much more so as it accelerates, where they're going to have to learn how to shepherd their flock through a culture that doesn't allow them to not be political.
And so one thing I want to bring up, right, while we're hitting all of the kind of nuclear tripwires, one of the kind of interesting thought experiments I'll run with friends of mine who are in ministry, right, is sort of asking the question, like, okay, like, what are your opinions on, transgenderism? And they're like, oh, they're, obviously have, nothing good to say about it. It is anathema, right? And so I kind of walked them through this. Like, okay, well, you've got to understand, you just described what the average person 70 years ago thought about, marriage between two racial groups, right? I don't view there as being a sin there, right? It was a cultural taboo, not a biblical one. But nonetheless, right, you have to understand that is the level of kind of cultural hatred directed towards that. Let's play this exact same, and they look back on those people as being kind of bigoted and backwards, and maybe there's some truth there. No, and I asked them, like, all right, let's play this out another 70 years in the future. Are you willing to say that same thing when you have the same kind of hatred directed towards those kind of bigoted racists from the past towards you for saying what you do about gay marriage or homosexuality or any one of those? Because you've got to realize, like, it is nowhere near as bad as it could be. The same kind of social taboo that we currently, attach towards race could very easily be attached towards sexual issues. And obviously, one has a scriptural basis and one doesn't. So there will always be, a certain percentage of churches that basically say, like, this is never acceptable. But I think people don't realize, like, that same kind of level of, like, social condemnation that you felt yourself, right, thinking about those people, literally everyone else will feel that about you. And that will become an extreme social taboo if certain trends continue. And so, I think that a lot of people are very, very quick to kind of mouth platitudes about, about martyrdom, like, oh, I'd take a bullet for this. And then they get really, really uncomfortable when someone says something they think might be, bigoted or homophobic or racist. And my point is it's like, well, if you say that, convince me, because I don't believe you, because so many of these people fold so quickly under the lightest social pressure. And so
Yeah.
is my point in this saying you should be bigoted, you should be racist, you should be homophobic, whatever that term means, right? No, but you should probably have a real hard think about, are you willing to, bear up to those kind of social pressures? And, like I said, like the fact is, right, that the stage of politics we're at is, of mutually incompatible visions. And so, when I look at these kind of, more respectable, conservative pastors who are very, very desperate to be accepted by wider culture, who want to be seen as good and respectable and not gross, like insert, your favorite punching bag. Well, effectively, they have already granted their enemies, and these people are our enemies, right? They have a fundamentally different view of, the nature of man, the nature of social order, any issue you can come up to. They have granted them access to a very core part of their brain, their motivation. They basically put a nose in their ring so that someone else can grab it and lead them around. And I mean, you see this in figures like David French. I don't like to talk about individual people. It can be a little bit scummy. But he actually did write the conservative case for, drag shows for children, the conservative case for why you shouldn't have the 10 Commandments displayed in public, the conservative case for literally everything that the people he's sworn to oppose think. And so again, because that is, that man has kind of shown his highest good to be the kind of acclaim of wider society, he gets led around by the nose. And, again, talking about the fact that everything is political, it is messy, right? Because it's like, well, okay, let's take that claim about, should drag queens be allowed to perform in front of children? Like, is that a political issue or is it a religious issue? And it's like, well, it's kind of both. It's messy. It's not this kind of like clean delineation that we like to think there used to exist. And so I understand why people are uncomfortable with it. It's not ideal. I'd love to live in a stable society where pretty much everyone agreed on most things. You look at, it's kind of funny, right? Like look at elections from like, 100 to 105 years ago. And it's like, well, what are the two parties? And it's like, well, we have the capitalist progressives who believe that we will get more capitalism and get more progress through allocating government funds a certain way. And then on the other side, you have the capitalist social progressives who believe that we can maximize social progress by spending more money on certain government programs. It's basically the same thing. And so obviously Americans have always loved politics. We've always had riots and things like that. It's kind of part of the culture. But fundamentally, look at the issue being discussed there. It is not these kind of first order claims. It's a second order claim, right? It's like, okay, we all generally, ascribe to the same social rules. Woodrow Wilson, for, as much as I dislike him, is not, debating about, what is the nature of a man? Can anyone decide to be whatever they want to be? And I don't particularly like Woodrow Wilson. It's just kind of acknowledging the incredible gulf between the two main cultures in America. And so, sorry, forgive me if I'm rambling, but I think that that's sort of the situation as it lies.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with you, and I think that only time will tell where we ultimately end up with this hot mess that we find ourselves in. And I just think that it's going to take a deeper level of thinking to get out of this, and that's why I appreciate you and your work. And I just think that we need to have more of these conversations that are ultimately going to be taboo at first, but over time, hopefully, we can get to a point where we can actually pretend we have a First Amendment and speak about whatever we want. But either way, Jay, I really appreciate you coming on. You give me a lot to think about, and I really appreciate that when a guest can do that for me. So where can people go to keep up with you and everything that you're doing?
So sure, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. That's the best source of my work. I will say the audio podcast is my preferred way for you to listen. YouTube is an absolutely horrible service, and I despise it. And yet, nonetheless, I begrudgingly upload all of my content there. But again, man, thank you so much for having me on, Connor. This is a great conversation. Thanks for just letting me kind of rant and rave on on a Monday evening.
Of course. Glad to have you. Well, thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate it. And feel free to repost this far and wide. It does help us out. And go ahead and check out our Substack, forgeandanvil.substack.com. You can put in your email for free and you can get the episode sent straight to your email, as well as additional content that I put out. And then, of course, there is an option for you to throw a tip in the jar and get a little extra. So feel free to check that out. Again, that's forgeandanvil.substack.com. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.